There we go. We should be good. Okay. Welcome to day 2. We have Danilo with us today, also working on the client team. And we're looking at CodeSandbox projects and how we do like state management, embracing React, but also exploring like how we could take advantage of state machines and how the application is very event driven. How do we deal with that and so on? And we're taking things a bit too far, like too frameworky. We kind of want to go back to the basics a little bit. And yesterday we looked at one of these features, as we call them. They're actually just context providers, and it's called branch management provider. And like we talked about, Alex, it really does two different things. And this is where it gets kind of tricky, because when you click the button of fork, you're really creating a branch. But if you don't have access to the repo, you actually do fork on GitHub. So we're going to mix these terms a little bit. But the point is that the branch management provider creates branches and it also lists branches. So we started exploring, like, we want to separate this. We want this to be like two different concepts. But as we were exploring this, we saw that the current usage of branch management is used in many different places, which kind of highlights that there is some shared state here. So if we were to like implement listing the branches and especially creating branches isolated in a hook, and we use that hook multiple places, it will be multiple instances of the same hook with different state, where you might start creating a branch through one hook and then the hook is used somewhere else as well. But then you don't see, so explicitly you kind of start creating a branch from the command palette, but the fork button doesn't update because the state isn't in sync. So we started talking about that kind of stuff. And then we talked a little bit about guarding the logic and running side effects and stuff like that. And we didn't want to end up in a place where we have like one context provider for every little thing. So in this case, we don't want to split this context provider into two context providers, because we don't want to have this high level bunch of context providers. So what we did is we discussed a little bit on Slack after the stream yesterday. So one idea is to kind of keep branch management provider, but consume it in different ways. So it's responsible for keeping the state and running side effects, but you can consume it more in isolation. So instead of having like one big generic use branch management hook, you would actually explicitly say, I'm going to do branching now. I'm calling it branching here instead of fork. And then, or I want to actually use the branches. But that is at least a way for us to kind of keep the number of context providers smaller. But we're still very explicit about how we're consuming it. Let's see, Maria is also joining here. This is fun. Add to the right. Hello, Maria.
Oh, now we have a perfect grid.
Yeah. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I was just doing a summary of all the discussions yesterday. And so this is like one approach to we want to have this shared state. We want to like isolate any side effects related to changing that state. But still we want to have a very explicit hooks API when we start consuming it. And how this would tie into picture client is that we could use the same concept there as well. So in picture client, there is like one main context provider, which gives you the instance of picture. But then we could have context providers representing the clients inside picture client. So we would have one provider for providing Git, but you would never consume like use Git. You would always do like use Git status, use Git commit. You would be very specific about it, but at least then you have the shared state, and the side effects will always run related to that shared state, and so on and so on. So that is like an approach. Does anyone have like experiences like how to manage the number of context providers versus hooks that they want to share, or should we just dive into the code and see how this would look like?
I think in terms of developer experience, having explicit hooks would be a great benefit. One of the there's a lot of repetition right now because you always have the use main thing, and then you destructure a bunch of things, and then you look for specific things, and then you're not in the state. You have to invent states just so that you have 3 different slices of the same thing on the same object.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's a good point.
Explicit hooks would definitely make consumption and reducers much more easier to deal with.
Yeah, that's also a good point. I didn't mention that. So like in branch management provider today, just like you say, Alex, it's like one object representing the state across all its different responsibilities. But in this concept, we would actually split that state object into its specific responsibilities. Kind of like it's kind of like Redux, like you have multiple reducers combined into one, so you can consume it. And it would be similar here. It becomes way more clear in the code example. But yeah, that's also a point here. One thing, maybe we shouldn't dive into that. I did like a proof of concept of shared reducers, but yeah, it doesn't matter for our use case. We should probably spend all our time on this.
I want to highlight how important the branch management needs to be a provider, because we have a permission level for a given user, and this information should come from a single place. It should be a source of truth. For example, if a user is not a beta user, we don't allow it then to forking, for example, or branching. So all buttons in the interface, all actions that try to fork a branch, it's first to check if the user is a beta or not, and then react based on this information. So it's important that the whole interface consumes this information from a single place, and that's the provider. It's very important.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's also a really good point. Like we have, like it's a complex application, and like centralizing the logic on what you can do when is really nice, instead of like just providing functionality to the UI, and the UI kind of has to figure out if they can do it or not. Is risky. As we just see here, like we have this primary call to action, but we also have like a fork command, we have register branch picker commands, and we have the branch error model. And all of these, like pointing to permissions, all of them would have to evaluate on their own. Like, can I do forking now or not? But we have centralized that in the branch management provider. So maybe we can, let's see, because I did a little bit of refactoring here to kind of explore this. Let's see. Become big. There we are. That's good. let's see. So previously, like branch management had like a reducer file, a types file. Yeah, a reducer file and a types file. But now, as we talked about, I rather split this up into the two responsibilities of what this branch management is responsible for. So now you have like a single, and then you can argue like, does this actually need to have these explicit states? It could be just a plain reducer, but the point here is that it's now defined as one reducer. It has its own state for fetching the branches. It has its own actions, and it has its own reducer definition for dealing with that. And the same goes for branching. That's one of the other concerns. Here we also have the explicit state related to doing branching, and it's actually quite complicated. It's kind of funny to see this, because you might so maybe I can change this to have the order a little bit better. So when you try to click that fork button up in the corner, what we're doing is that we kind of say that we want to create a branch, but you might not have access to it, which means that we go into forking mode instead. So this actually happens within the provider as well. So the UI doesn't know if this forking is going to result in just a branch or an actual fork, which is also a nice separation of concern. But no matter, this is now like an isolated reducer as well, with its own states, its own actions, and its own reducer definition. Now this reducer is the only thing that really cares about if it's a beta user and the permission. So the branches reducer is just a plain reducer, but the branching reducer is like a factory because it needs to know about beta users and permission. And the way this is exposed through the provider now is that if we go to the feature, so this is like a new kind of pattern related to that. We don't really want two different context providers exposing each of these reducers. We kind of just want one reducer where we just namespace the two different things, just like Redux. At least that's the approach here, and we can discuss that, of course. But the approach here is, it's basically like Redux, where you just say, okay, I have two reducers and I want to combine them into one reducer under the namespace branches and under the namespace branching. And that's what's happening here. It returns a reducer which has the branching state and the branches state and the actions from both of them. Oh yeah, there's something wrong with the typing here, but we can look at that later. But the point is that we actually now have a single reducer that we can still expose through the context provider. And then what we would do here is that we could now say export const use branching, for example. And we could say use context from React. We'll use this context. And now I'm going to fix the typing first, by the way, because this is not going to work right now. We could say use branching, and what we would expose here is actually the branching state, which is not typed there right now, but just imagine it is. You can fix that. And what we talked about, Alex, is that these hooks, because now these hooks are, since they're so generic, like going back to the Excalibur, since they're so generic, they kind of just expose the reducer as is. You get the state, like you get the tuple of the state and the dispatcher, and then we dispatch all over. But when we're more specific with the hooks, we can actually take the opportunity to be more specific about the API of the hook. So for example, here maybe we want to create and then create draft, for example. I think that's the two things we actually do. We either name the branch beforehand or we just generate a name. Where we could do the actual dispatch under the hood. Oh, shouldn't there be? Oh, dispatch read write. Oh, I thought. Oh, sorry. Sorry. It's a factory, like where it's a function that returns the reducer. So the typing was a little bit off here. There we go. So here we would say, what's it called? Create branch. And then we would have to, I can't remember exactly what it needs. Branch name. So we could do something like this, for example. And then
I think once these hooks are more specialized, it's okay to also return the dispatch directly.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so that's
Probably
something.
Depends. Like we could have a scenario where this is better, but for this specific example, I think it's just easier to return the use context. So basically, use branching would be simply exposing the the context, the pair.
What we can do though is we can say that this actually returns branching state, and it returns the dispatch for branching action. So it's at least typed to the dispatcher is typed to the thing you're interacting with. So when you do use branching and you consume it in a component, when you call dispatch, it will only give you the actions related to branching, which is nice. Like technically you could dispatch whatever you want there, but it will be more context aware of what you're trying to do from the point of consumption.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, maybe that's a nice pattern. And then you would do like use, what's it called? Branches? Was it branches?
Branches.
Yeah.
And then branches. I'm going to fix that very, very quickly. Yeah, so that's kind of through the explorations yesterday and the conversations we had earlier, Alex, this is kind of where things led in my mind, is that we still have the context providers. We don't have to call them features, but there are context providers. But instead of making one big reducer, we can split them up into responsibilities, but we do combine them into a single reducer, where rather the hooks represents what part of, like, which reducer are we actually interacting with.
I do like the concept of a feature still. I think it makes a lot of sense. Like I said yesterday or some other day, I don't remember when, it's even like a pattern for documenting the project. Like someone who would get onboarded into this could easily just go through the features, and instead of branch management, you see, oh, it's fork, switch branch, fetch branch. For Git, it's commit, pull, whatever other features we can isolate in with a single reducer, like smaller reducers and so on. So in a way, I would stick to the concept of a feature for the smaller atomic things that we expose there.
Yeah, so you mean like the whole, like branch management you would call a feature, or you would kind of call the hook a feature?
No, the hook, the hook with its reducer.
Yeah.
Because then if you think about okay, where is the logic for the fork?
Yeah.
Well, the logic for the fork is 100% in branching, right? Everything you need to if you need to change something, like let's say you want to append something to all the branches, like we do draft now, you probably will go to the branching feature, and that's where you would find the logic. Not, you don't need to search for it in some generic feature file, or
yeah,
even
exactly.
searching by name, like the fact that you give a proper name to this file. So like whenever I think of branching, let's say if branching, maybe branch is a bit confusing here, because branching branches is it's very close, but commit is a better example, right? If I search for a file called, I search feature commit, then I get that file as the first match. So I can easily say, if, like, I know there's a feature at some point, say like, let's put a different default message for the commit, or let's do conditional staging before the commit. That's where you find the logic again.
Yeah, exactly. So you would you wouldn't create folders by the provider. You would rather create folders by like the explicit reducers.
It could also be like, it could be like providers, and then inside each provider we could have a features folder, if that's not complicated. But I guess what I would like to see is a simulation. I will try to do that today. What does it mean to take all the current features and extract the actual features from them? Currently, some of the features are more like umbrellas over multiple features, like the branch management was a perfect example for that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like it's so interesting, like building complex.
The best example. I don't want us to tackle it into the stream now, but the workspace is like an umbrella provider over everything that you need to persist basically visually on the screen. But then it has internally, it has a feature for managing the sidebar, a feature for managing the sidekick, a feature for managing the file tabs, which is extracted in another feature. So like all that confusion can probably go away with a single workspace provider. But that exposes 5 different features for 5 different areas of the screen that get managed there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because it's like keeping in mind like discoverability as well. That's kind of the trickiest thing with like with just having files and folders. Like it's kind of funny, like writing code is not very, like files and folders is not very representative of like the mental model of the code. Sometimes it is, but often not. And then making it easy to like, okay, you need something, like intuitively, which folder do you go to? But I like the idea of thinking about like the isolated responsibilities as features instead of like the big scope of a provider.
And I would argue here that the branches is not necessarily a feature, but more like just a fetch that can be doesn't, like, it's one of those fetches that doesn't really need state modeling, so it can very well just be like use SVR, that's the endpoint, fetch it, cache it, and so on.
Exactly. Yeah, because that's what I like about this as well, is that when you isolate the responsibilities more, it's easier to use the right tool for the job. So that's a good point.
So
yeah,
maybe,
exactly.
Maybe some of the features are simple, like data fetching patterns. Like, for example, that's the pattern that we can then use also in the dashboard, where most of the features are data fetching already.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we can have, like, it's almost like each feature can have a different strategy. It can be a state model with React states. It can be something like an SVR fetch, GraphQL fetch, also with SVR or something.
Yeah, and even using hooks from Pitcher client.
Yeah, exactly. Or even just saying, okay, this is data that Pitcher client takes care of. I just want to expose it as a feature because I need access to the shell, for example, is a good example of that.
Yeah.
Don't really need to model. Maybe not. I don't know. I have to look into it. But a lot of the shell operations are just like read, write, open, close, are very feature driven. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's such a good point as well, and that's why we were lucky to kind of tackle branch management first, I think, because it didn't have too many responsibilities. It just had two, which is enough for us to think about to split them up. And then one of the responsibilities turns out to be such a simple data fetching thing that bringing in like transitions for that doesn't really make sense. Like we can just use the use SWR hook, for example. But for the branching part, that's like more complex again. So there it makes more sense, at least. Because that's also was the thing. Like the feature was initially like this frameworky React states kind of thing, but that's not the intention. It's just a way for us to think about the functionality of the app and then choosing the right tool for the job.
Yeah, Alex makes me to think what it really the final feature is, and if it is a state management, or I don't know if it holds all the information for the entire interface. So maybe we can start to redefine what exactly a feature is and what is it responsible for.
Yeah.
I think it's also like it can also be called like capability or ability or something like that. Maybe that makes it clearer. Because I'm thinking now like like a feature is it's a very generic word that like a feature can be just a UI interaction which doesn't have anything to do with this layer. So we can also use like something like capability, like from the branch, like the branch provider is added, and once the branch provider is added, there are these 3 or 4 or 2 or whatever. There are capabilities that get added to the project. One is a data fetching type of capability. One is more like a state. It's more like more like a state interactivity. I don't know how to call it. The other one.
It's kind of interesting you say that, because it kind of ties to Pitcher, like how Pitcher client is modeled as well. It's like you have a client with capabilities. So but yeah,
it makes me wonder a bit about the one thing which feels like a bit of a code smell here is the dynamic nature of the reducer, with the dependencies that are basically coming from above.
Mm-hmm.
My biggest concern here is also a bit in terms of performance. We had some issues with dynamic reducers in the past.
Oh, you mean this thing? Yeah. I when I refactored this, I started thinking about that, but then I dropped it just to get it done. But yeah, let's talk about that.
Or at least, or maybe let's not jump to it. If anyone else wants to add anything on the concept of like big providers and smaller features / capabilities, how does that model sound for everyone before we move on to something else? I like the big provider, small feature.
We could. I like your idea, Alex, about like if you take that concept and kind of, as you said, simulate it. Like, what would the current features look like if we actually did this split? And then it's also easier to evaluate if it's something that works for us.
Yeah.
Okay, dynamic reducers.
Yeah.
If you think about it, there's a lot of dynamic stuff going on with hooks. Like when you define any component with a use effect, with use state, using callback instead of the initial value, just right in there. Like React does a ton of duplication on creating functions. So my perspective on it, it's kind of like the big discussion on, I remember I had this discussion a long time ago about inlining functions in onClicks. I had a colleague who was like, no, you can't inline functions because you're duplicating them every time it reconciles. It creates a new function, which is sometimes like valid that you don't want to do that. But like typically you don't care about it. It's just nice to inline it, and then you just don't care about it. But at some point you do, of course. But I think about this the same way. Like it's kind of like just inlining an onClick. It's not a big deal. But I have no data or metrics to back that up.
The need for this basically is we need some data in the reducer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would the pattern work where we pass that data as a prop to the provider, or actually it is a prop to the provider?
Yeah, it is a prop now. Yeah. Like the bigger, is it bigger? I think, yeah.
We have to carry that data in too many places right now. It feels like it will be a bit boilerplatey and especially with, for example, with permissions getting more and more important,
mm-hmm.
and probably more granular, it's gonna be all over the place.
Yeah.
We have more features.
And like a hidden problem here is that the first time, like when we pass this, we have like true or false, or we have read or write. And then we pass that into the initial reducer that we're creating. So the second time it reconciles, it's not actually creating a new reducer. It doesn't replace the existing reducer. It's kind of like if you use reducer and you kind of inline the reducer this way, and you were to reference some outer prop, as far as I know, at least. So let's say it's like a state number, action, whatever, increment. So if you were to reference like, this is kind of silly. So if you're a beta user, like I don't know, something like that. My point is that if you were to change beta user to false, it wouldn't actually update inside this reducer, because it only uses the first time use reducer runs. That's the function it will use. That's at least true for use state.
Yeah, that's why I was wondering, isn't it maybe easier maybe it's counterintuitive, but we could pass those props into the state when we initialize
the initial state. Yeah.
And then you also need the same problem with the initial state, but that's easily solvable with like a use effect that every time prop changes, you update the state.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's how you should do it, because then, well, no, because that that doesn't really solve it.
You can provide the initial state depending on where you're using it.
Yeah. So like the only way to really deal with it, I think, which is, it's so hidden, but it's that you actually have to create a key. So when you consume the provider, you have to make a key of permission and is beta user. so that whenever either of those change, it will remount the provider and then actually create a new reducer function for you, which is like insane.
Yeah, this will not persist the state.
Yeah.
Like the previous state we have.
One of those React things.
True.
That.
Yeah, and it like the reason we haven't dealt with this here is because you can't really change your beta user or permission during like a session. So we kind of excused ourselves with that, but that is like a serious problem with dynamic reducers.
But what about? I was thinking like the data, instead of passing props, we can also consume it via hooks. So you could say is beta and permission can be destructured from use project or whatever hook will expose that. And you can use that inside the provider, but then you get the real data. Every time the data changes, you get the provider does execute, right? Yeah, but you still need to update the state, or you need to.
What you could do, like,
Sorry, like just one idea. Can we inline the reducer in the provider? No, that doesn't work because
it's only the first one.
Big mess.
But if you remember us creating the. We had a bug with the JVT token because we were just passing the initial JVT token, and then we rather made a function to fetch the latest JVT token. And we could actually do the same here. So like get dynamic data. This is, I wouldn't call it that, but you could like do how would this work? Okay, so I think this will work. Use callback. No, that wouldn't work either. Well, dynamic data. What you could do, you could use a ref. And then
maybe I use memo, and then you can pass the pandas. Like you use a memo, and then you can pass the pandas as is beta user and permission in the dependence of the user memo.
Yeah, it's just that you will kind of get a reference. So like internally, maybe we should bring back the other reducer. It's easier to talk about that one. I think even with use memo, it would still like close over. If that memo is like a function or it's an object, it would still like close over that specific function or that object. Yeah. So I think the only way to really deal with it is if you were to like use a ref. And then like this is the thing with React, like doing this kind of stuff is so difficult because you can't just point to this, like this.is beta user, and whenever it changes you just have the latest value. But you could do this, and then every time it renders you update it. So it's kind of silly to have it pass the initial stuff there, and then you would pass the ref in, so ref current. So you wouldn't pass ref current, you would like pass the ref into the reducer, and that would be the same reference every time. But when you point to .current, it will always be the latest value from the latest reconciliation of the.
We could say like this is like a context, not context is a bad word, but it's kind of like the context in which the reducer executes, right? Closure.
Yeah, exactly. Reducer context, yeah, something like that. Yeah. Like using words is often like such a good excuse for concept.
That's great.
Oh, that's funny. But yeah, it's interesting. Like, and this is the problem with hooks. This is exactly the problem with hooks. It's kind of creating that mental model of what does the functions actually close over in terms of the props being passed in and everything else. It's like you could even, especially with use effect, where you have like the dependency list, like the array as the second argument. You can look at a component using like 3 different use effects with different dependencies, and you have like through the reconciliations of that component, you have like 3 different versions of it through time. Like the first use effect is always up to date to the latest reconciliation, but the other one might be like 2 reconciliations back, and then the third one will be like it only did the first reconciliation kind of thing. It's kind of crazy. But yeah,
I don't know if passing a ref versus just passing the data is more straightforward.
Yeah.
But yeah, the problem is that like this, at least this one works with dynamic props as well.
Yeah.
As in, if we need to pass, let's say, the list of tasks to a feature or something,
yeah,
to a provider, and that list of tasks can change frequently.
Ship it. It's super interesting. There was one thing I was hoping, unless you want to talk more about it.
Yeah, no, let's revisit the. I'm calling them dynamic reducers. I'm not sure if that's the right term for them, but
yeah,
let's revisit them in a subsequent.
Sorry, Oscar is home sick today. It's my partner asking me to come downstairs. She'll have to wait until after the stream. Yeah, because one thing I thought we could talk about is one thing is like the reducer just manages state, but then we have like certain side effects related to those state changes. And in this case, we are, let's see, I thought maybe we could just go through like each of these and kind of just talk about them. And then also how would that relate to us isolating, because now we're kind of isolating the reducer, but the reducer might have side effects related to it. Which should probably be defined within the same context as the reducer, but we can go back to that. But one thing is like we have this combined reducer that the provider exposes now, and we have the 2 hooks that consumes like a namespace within that reducer, which is typed to that namespace and the actions related to that namespace, which is nice. But we also need, in this case, we're like subscribing to some events. And I'm just doing this explicitly now because we're changing to a later version of React states. Yeah, so this is just subscribing to events from the API and shoving it into the reducer. And then we have use state effect. So for example, when we, as we talked about, fetching the branches is probably something we won't do with this concept, but it's just an example. So here we are actually doing a side effect of a state change inside branches. So one thing we could do is we could put them in there. So as an example, use branches. Oh, that's the same name. Like that's my question really. It's like you have this provider that's the only one who knows about the state. And would you define all side effects within the provider? Or would you just tell the provider to, in this case, use branches effects, for example? And this would take the state and dispatch. And this would be state, dispatch, action. So you kind of do this instead. Boop. Boop. And you would do...
Interesting.
I think, yeah, it needs some collocation, like that would be. But can't we use create reducer in the API? Can't we use that inside each of the smaller features?
Yeah, so that's also...
and then just export the state and dispatch and then combine it in the...
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because the reason I went down this path is that right now we just expose the reducer. So in terms of reconciliation, it's very straightforward. Like the only reason it will tell any consumers about the change is when there's a state change in the reducer. But if we were to like create two reducers, and you would do like this, you would have branching reducer, and then what was it? Branches. Like if there's some reconciliation happening from the top, it would always tell its consumers to update because it's a new object every time, regardless of either of these reducers changing their state. You can fix it, like you can like use memo and then have like branching reducer, branches reducer.
Well, I don't see what's the difference. Isn't it the same? Because you want to get the same thing because of the combined reducers at the top. Like again, like just one of the
like if
reducers executing, and then you still get a new object that you need to pass in, a new object reference for the provider value.
Yeah. So like if branching reducer changes its, like with the current concept, if branching reducer changes its state, it will also the branches consumers will update because it's like one reducer updating. But this is more like if a parent component of this provider causes a reconciliation, so it's unrelated to.
Yeah. I see now.
Which is arguably not a problem at all, but like it's a consequence. Yeah.
Well, this use memo can be probably used in that can be combined with that combined reducers, and at least you get the same value if for whatever reason the value needs to recompute because of the parent reconciliation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you could rather like you would rather just define the reducer here as a plain reducer and return it like the actual use reducer. Maybe we can quickly, can just write it. Let's see. So what do we call this? Branches, use reducer. Oh, it wants its initial state. Yeah, so you would kind of do and then you could rather have owner and repo up here, Not sure why this is complaining. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's called fetching. And then here you would rather grab the, what do I call it? Use branches. Yeah, I'm just calling it use branches effects, which is weird, but oh. And then you would just shove it right here, so you have the reducer there. I think that makes more sense, because then you basically the feature or the capability or what you want to call it, it's kind of like a sub feature where you define in isolation the reducer. It's basically a hook for providing the reducer.
To collocate the effect here. Normally, I think when we're building any new feature, you're constantly shifting from dispatching something, doing a transition, making an effect, going back. So like it's very, you think of it as a one, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that makes sense. Like it's kind of like we kind of identified like the bigger features of the CodeSandbox projects, but we haven't found a good pattern to like separate their responsibilities. So it's like you say, Alex, it's not like the providers that is the problem. It's just that we're not expressing their responsibilities in isolation, and we can't consume their responsibilities in isolation. So doing that as like combine the reducer into one, or just exposing multiple reducers from the provider, that's just two different ways of achieving the same. But I do like this better personally, because it just, you contain more of it. Like this is branches with its reducer and its side effects.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does it actually, no, use memo. That's like this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the way this would actually look like, maybe we can, so you would you wouldn't have any of, yeah, you wouldn't have any of this. Yeah, and what's kind of cool is that you would actually have dev tooling on the level of each sub feature.
Yeah. Which is
nice.
Again very useful, I think, for we could technically implement some sort of like categories there, so that at least we can group things if they get too big. Give it just a long list of features, but it's much easier to keep track of the state.
Exactly.
Rather than, for example, opening the workspace right now in the DevTools and trying to figure out what changed between 3 or 4 different events that the workspace reacted to.
Exactly. And then I guess, yeah. I guess you would probably just expose, this would just be a re-export then. So you would like use branching from branching kind of thing. So you would also define the hook for consuming.
Provider can be implemented in the index file of these folders now, because it's not something that you regularly look at. It's just like a support code, so to say.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can have a test file for each feature, which is again nice.
Yeah, because I remember us doing this, and it's really annoying. It's like a nice idea for structure, but actually dealing with it every time we implement, it's so annoying. But yeah, I like that. Like you have an index file, which is the provider of one or multiple features. And then you can define those each in its own file, where you have either a reducer or you're using use SVR. It doesn't matter. Like you use the tool for the job for that feature. But what you expect is it to provide its functionality through a hook to the provider, so that the provider can kind of expose that functionality to. So it's like a single context.
I like this.
Yeah, and I guess
I like word.
Yeah. I think maybe we would want to have use branching here because it needs to point to the. So you would rather do of course. You would branches because it uses the context of the provider. So you would just do this basically. Yeah. And then one of them might be a reducer with state and dispatch. One of them might be like the whatever's returned from use SVR.
Or some picture client.
Yeah, or some picture client thing.
Access.
But we avoid having like one context provider for every little thing that we do. We're able to like encapsulate a set of features related to a domain. So I guess it has kind of two purposes. It's like reducing the amount of context providers, but it's also encapsulating a set of features in a domain.
Yeah.
We could try that. Maybe we could.
I can see like one of my ideas is to see if we can reuse the approach for other pages.
Yeah.
And I can see this working for the dashboard as well, or for the Kanban, where right now I think mostly it's just data fetching, but in the future it could be more like, for example, I'm thinking of a review, more focus on the review side in the Kanban. Then you can start adding. It's much easier. It's a much more easier entry barrier to just add a small feature that manages some review flows with a reducer, with transitions, with everything. It's more explicit. It's easier to think about it. It's easier to test. Yeah, everything. But then the rest of the features in the dashboard are just plain old like GraphQL requests, subscriptions, whatever. We'll probably try to figure out how to combine the patterns.
Yeah, exactly. I guess like one thing that, but maybe that is one thing that I guess is a little bit weird here is that, so for example, use branching, like if it's just like use as, like the reason we kind of put it into a context provider is more to like have shared state and making sure that side effects related to that state only runs, like there's a singleton of the state and its side effects. But like use branching, if it's doing use SWR, it doesn't need to be exposed on the context. It could just be a hook exposing that directly. Like it doesn't need to be a context. It's not like a big deal to provide it on the context, but it strictly doesn't need to.
Yeah.
So in that sense, like the context would be more there. Like it's it kind of hides the fact that does the hook need to be like a singleton, or does it not need? Like the thing is, like when you consume it, so imagine like you're consuming use branching and use branches. You don't care if it's being consumed through the context or if it's just a hook. The context is just there to facilitate having like singleton hooks. And from a consumption standpoint, you don't care about that. It's just how you choose to implement it here. If you use the context, we make sure that the hook is a singleton. If you don't use the context, it will be a new hook every time you use it.
Yeah, and it also solves the problem with dynamic reducer that we were talking about, right? Like you used to have the dynamic reducer, and I think this covered this problem, right?
It will still need to be somewhere here, passed from the provider to the.
Oh yeah. That's a good point as well. Like, oh yeah, maybe that's also a good point. Like one thing is the singleton thing, but like if you pass something into the provider, like a prop, and like even though the hook doesn't really, that's interesting. Yeah, it's also so it's kind of two things. It's kind of it ensures that like the hook being provided is like a singleton, but also it's what's it called, like a way to pass props into hooks. So like even though, so for example, let's imagine like you used use SWR inside use branching, which strictly doesn't require a context provider, but it might need to use properties coming in from the context provider. Maybe it needs to know about permissions or being a beta user. In that case, you would want to expose it on the context because that's where it actually gets access to the props from. So you would kind of pass permission in here. And then even though use provide branching is just a use SWR, it now has access to these top level props being passed into the provider. It's like a way to configure the features.
Yeah, I'll take some time to go through some of the features to see how they can be split.
Yeah, I think that's a good next step. And then, there's a lot of stuff for reflection here. So maybe we can just do that. We'll kind of diverge to reflection mode and then kind of see, as you said, Alex, like an overview of how does this structure look like in terms of files and folders with all the other features, and then we should have like some sense of where it's getting us.
Yeah, sounds good.
It's so nice. You have this intuition of like turning your head when you're thinking, so that we understand that you're thinking, Alex.
I was thinking of like there are these things around like permissions. There's also the idea of the commands behind the command palette and how I am trying to figure out how it all fits together on the long term.
Yeah.
Because ultimately what we're trying to do is have a good developer experience with this, but at the same time take advantage of, like, I think the pattern of using a reducer and dispatching actions is great for predictable state management, and it's something that we definitely benefit from. And then the question is, how does it all tie together so that it scales? I guess that's the problem. We enter the phase of where we need to scale the initial model, which doesn't work if we just scale it linearly, I believe, as it is right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but is that the 2 action points then? Reflection and tomorrow. Are you able to join tomorrow, Alex? Or we could just do it on the stream, like look at the features, use ExcaliDraw, and
I think I have time today to look at that a bit. Yeah, and then we can talk tomorrow.
Yup. Great. But I guess we have other stuff to do as well. But yeah, this was nice. We're getting somewhere, I feel like, and it's just finding, as you said, like we thought, like that's the story. Like you think you have a pattern that scales until it doesn't scale, and then you have to like reimagine it. And I'm happy, like we're finding ways to more like decoupling what we have instead of like moving to a completely different concept, which is nice. That's going to make it much easier to transition. We can take like one feature at a time even, which is great. Cool. I guess that's it. We'll talk later.
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll bump you tomorrow as well, and then we'll just meet here, or we'll just talk on Slack or Gather.